I want to share with you an interesting chart, which is the GDP per capita of the top 10 nations, ranked by GDP per capita, approximately in 2025. Coming in at number one is Luxembourg at $143,740. Number two is Switzerland at $105,000. Number three, Ireland at $104,000. Number four is Norway at $94,000. Number five is Singapore at $91,000. Number six is Qatar at $82,000. Number seven is Denmark at $73,000. Number eight, Iceland at $73,000. Number nine, the United States at $71,000. And number 10, Australia at $66,000. You notice that the top 8 nations are actually very small countries. They're really city-states with populations under or around 3 to 4 million or less. Very small countries, most of them heavily into finance or oil. So they're very resource rich, or they're very heavily into finance. The only countries outside of this is the United States, and even Australia is actually a pretty small country in terms of population. I believe their population is under 5 million. Even though their landmass is huge, most of the people live in just in two to three cities. Now let's take a look at column 4, which is the GDP per capita once you remove the top 10%. And look how dramatically it changes. Even in a country like Luxembourg, we're going to see a decrease in GDP by almost 17%. And you can see the wealth disparity based on this. Switzerland drops by 22% in GDP per capita. Ireland drops by 28%. Norway by 16%. Singapore by 33%. 1/3 of the wealth per capita is removed once you erase the top 10% of earners. Qatar, 38%, almost 39%. Denmark, 16.7%. Iceland, 16.7%. The US, 39%. So almost 40% of the GDP per capita is erased once you remove the top 10%. Australia drops 22%. So the US drops on a per GDP per capita level from 71,000 to 43,000 once you remove the top 10% of the earners. This is the wealth disparity at work. Now let's look at column 5. Or column 6. GDP per capita, bottom 75%. So once you remove the top 25% of the earners, what do we have? Luxembourg drops 26%, 26.6%. Switzerland drops 33% in earnings. Ireland drops 40%. Norway drops 26.7%. Singapore drops almost 50%. Qatar drops 53.3%. Denmark drops 26.7%. Iceland drops 26.7%. The United States drops 53.3%. Australia drops 33%. So looking at the US, we went from 71,000 in GDP per capita to 43,000 once you remove the top 10%. And then once you remove the top 25%, income drops to 33,000 per capita GDP, or GDP per capita. So dropped by more than half. Now keep in mind that in the US, the majority of citizens don't even pay a national income tax, a federal income tax. The top 20-30% of income earners pay more than 50% of all income taxes. The bottom 50% are net gainers from the federal government, and that means that they literally receive a net benefit from the government versus paying into the government. And their income also drops dramatically from 71,000 per GDP per capita to 33,000 GDP per capita. Now let's look at another interesting chart. Now we're going to look at the same information but based on PPP, which is purchasing power parity. Now purchasing power parity tells you what an actual person or how an actual person is living in a country. So this is discounting price differences, but actually what people are paying in terms of housing, food, transportation, energy, and what it feels like to live in that country. So for example, you could be paying in the US $20 for a meal at McDonald's, but let's say you go to China, you'll only be paying, let's say, for example, $7 or $5. So even though the GDP per capita in the US is much higher than China, when you actually live in China and earn in China, it may not feel that way because you're paying so much less. You're earning less, but you're also paying a lot less for medical services, for food, for rent, for housing, etc. So PPP is a great way to see how people actually live. So based on PPP per capita, Qatar comes in at number 1 at 141,000. Luxembourg comes in at number 2 at 126,000. Singapore, number 3 at 116,000. Ireland, number 4 at 108,000. Switzerland, number 5 at 88,000. Norway, number 6 at 87,000. The United States, number 7 at 80,000. Notice how these numbers are all reduced. Number 8 is Denmark at 74,000. Number 9, Iceland at 67,000. And number 10, Australia at 65,000. So again, notice that all of these nations are very small countries with small population bases, all usually under 5 million people in population. The United States is the only country here with a substantial population base over 300 million. So the rest of these countries, 9 out of 10, are really city-states and very easy to manage. So when anyone argues that why can't the U.S. be like these other countries, they can't because the U.S. has a population of over 350 million, whereas these other countries are small, population is small, the size of Los Angeles, the size of San Francisco, and politicians are close to home. They're more accountable. And bureaucrats are more accountable for what they do. So it's easier and it's simpler to manage government finances. Whereas in the U.S., because politicians and bureaucrats are far away, there's more mismanagement. Okay, let's look at GDP per capita for the top 90% or the bottom 90% once you remove the top 10% in terms of purchasing power parity. Now, specifically looking at the United States, we can see that the U.S. drops from 80,000 in PPP per capita to 49,000 in PPP per capita, a drop of 39%. Even Qatar drops 39%. Singapore even drops by 33%. Switzerland drops 22% from 88,000 to 69,000. Denmark drops from 74,000 to 62,000, a drop of 16.7%. Looking at the bottom 75% of earners, if we remove the top 25% of income earners in PPP, looking at number 7, the United States, they drop 65%, and their PPP per capita feels like they're earning only $28,000. So they're dropping from 80,000 to 28,000. And this is reflecting the income disparity in these countries. Even Singapore went from 116,000 to 62,000 in PPP, a drop of 46%, which is not bad. That's pretty good. 62,000 in PPP. Luxembourg is still at 92,000 per PPP at 27%. Australia is at 43,000. So the nation with the biggest, the largest, steepest drop is the US, dropping 65% and earning only $28,000, the lowest in its entire group in terms of PPP. Let's take a look at the GDP per capita in terms of PPP for select countries, the dominant global nations, comparing the US, China, Germany, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Thailand, Mexico, Canada, Russia, Brazil, France, and the UK. In column 2, we got GDP per capita in terms of PPP. We have US in at 80,000. China coming in at 25,000. Germany, 66,000. South Korea, 56,000. Japan, 49,000. Taiwan, 68,000. Thailand, 23,000. Mexico, 26,000. Canada, 60,000. Russia, 36,000. Brazil, 20,000. France, 58,000. And the UK at 56,000. We remove the top 10% of earners, and we're going to see some dramatic drops. Again, US dropping 39%. China drops 30%. Germany drops 20%. South Korea drops 27%. Japan drops 20%. So we can see that South Korea has a larger income disparity than Japan. Taiwan drops 28%, which again signifies a higher income gap. Thailand drops 30%. Mexico drops 35% to 17,000. Canada drops 25%. Russia drops 35%. Brazil drops 35%. France drops 20%, and the UK drops 25%. The larger the drop, the larger the income disparity per nation. Now, the final section, we remove the top 25% of income earners, and we see an income drop of 65% in the US, a drop of 45% in China. So even in a communist capitalist country like China, a communist political system with a capitalist economic system, they're dropping 45% income once you remove the top 25% of earners. Germany drops 30%. So you can almost see that Germany has likely more of a socialist economic system than even China. South Korea drops 40% to 34,000 per capita PPP. Japan drops 30% to 34,755. So the standard of living in Japan and South Korea they're pretty much the same for the bottom 75%. Taiwan is surprisingly at 41,000, although they drop 40% for the bottom 75%. Their income for the average Taiwanese for the bottom 75% is 7,000 higher than in Japan or South Korea. I would not have expected that. Thailand is at 12,800, dropping 45%. Their income disparity is quite high. Mexico drops 50% and comes in at 13,000. Canada drops 35%. Russia drops 50%. So their drop in Russia, their drop is less than in the US, 50% compared to 65%. Brazil drops 50%. France drops 30%, and their per capita PPP, or the PPP per capita, comes in at 41,000. Surprisingly high. 41,279, right there with Taiwan. So the standard of living for the bottom 75% in France is pretty close to those in Taiwan, and not too far above South Korea and Japan. I'm surprised that their PPP for the bottom 75% is so high in France. And also UK dropping 35% is at 36,000, right there with South Korea and Japan. I wonder if you asked the average citizen in France or the UK about the cost of living there, if they would be so sanguine based on this statistic. I would think that the standard of living in Japan and South Korea and Taiwan was much higher than in France or the UK, or maybe even in Canada. But here's a good comparison of all the major nations and some interesting spots around the world, like in Mexico and Thailand, Brazil, and China. We could see the approximate standard of living as far as what it really feels like to buy a Big Mac or buy a beer or perhaps get a cab in these countries based on purchasing power parity. And you can see the dramatic drops in the U.S. You can see that the average American, although the U.S. is as a whole, a very wealthy nation, the average person in America doesn't feel rich at all. Although you really wouldn't know that, given that in today's generation, every kid has got an iPhone, every kid's got a smartphone, they all probably have about 3-4 pairs of shoes, 30 t-shirts, and so forth. They live much better than prior generations in the U.S. You wouldn't know that, but based on purchasing power parity, they don't live so well. They don't feel so rich. It costs a lot in the U.S. to see a doctor because it's being socialized. And many people are calling for more government intervention in terms of monetizing our medical system and our school system. So here we are in 2025.